Donc, on va commencer cette deuxième journée donc, de ce colloque sur la laïcité avec un exposé du père Cyril Overoon, qui est archimandrite. Donc, si j'ai bien compris, c'est un titre honorifique. Voilà, donc, il est moine avec un titre spécial dans l'Église orthodoxe. En même temps, il est aussi théologien. C'est un théologien très connu, je dirais, dans le monde orthodoxe, donc théologien ukrainien. Il a eu aussi dans le passé des charges assez importantes ecclésiastiques, donc dans l'Église orthodoxe ukrainienne et l'Église orthodoxe russe. Et actuellement, il est professeur d'ecclésiologie et de relations internationales au collège Saint Ignatius à Stockholm, en Suède. Il est aussi l'auteur de plusieurs ouvrages d'ecclésiologie et de théologie politique, rédigés en russe, ukrainien et anglais. Voilà, donc je laisse la parole. Donc, il va intervenir en anglais. Je pense que tout le monde ici comprend très bien l'anglais. Vous pouvez poser les questions soit en anglais, soit vraiment, si c'est trop difficile, vous les posez en français. On va essayer de les traduire ensuite en anglais. Voilà, merci.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much. It seems I'll be the only speaker speaking in English. I apologize for that. I hope it will not cause any big problem. Also, I'll be speaking on the topic that is different from what I was speaking during the last month, which was mostly the topic of the war. And I'm quite kind of happy to speak on something different from the war eventually. But it will be still on the situation in the Soviet Union, in Russia, and other Soviet territories, or the territories under the Soviet influence, especially during the Cold War. And I will explore the phenomenon of secularization in the Soviet setting under communism. Most Eastern European nations, which in the interwar period developed right-wing dictatorships, after the World War II switched to the opposite left-wing ideologies. The leftist regimes were instead instated and supported by the Soviet Union. The churches in these countries had to accommodate themselves to the new political realities and sometimes made a U-turn in their ideological preferences. Most hierarchs chose to collaborate with the new regimes, even though the latter had declared themselves atheist. Well, just an example, probably of the most radical, the sharpest U-turn in the attitude of the churches to the regime is probably Romania. Like before the war, it was really into the right-wing ideology with the ideology of the Iron Legion, the Legion of St. Michael, and after the war, it became very much affiliated with the communist ideology and regime. But this is just a footnote. And official theologians, following the ideological mainstream, invented theological justifications now for the leftist ideologies. So before the war, the theologians worked hard to promote the right-wing ideologies. Let us remember Nikifor Krajnik, probably one of the most outspoken Romanian theologian based in Chisinau, right? He was a professor of theology in Chisinau. And after the World War II, there were theologians who tried somehow to justify the new political reality. Not Krajnik, but others. And for example, such theologians drew parallels between communism and Christianity, stressing communal life, equality, and sharing property. Some Russian hierarchs and theologians became advocates for the Soviet atheist quasi-empire. Just an example, it struck me, the Patriarch of Moscow, Sergei Stragorodsky. I read his diaries before the revolution. And he was absolutely, enthusiastic about the Tsarist regime. he praised the Tsar. He radiated this kind of joy about touching, the royalty, the Russian royalty. And after the revolution, as we know, he signed his famous, or rather infamous, declaration in 1927, about which I will talk briefly. Both Russian revolutions of 1917 in February and October polarized the Russian church and led to divisions and schisms within it. These schisms were along ideological lines. One part of the church remained faithful to the ideals of the Russian monarchy. This part organized itself in what would become known as the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, ROKOR. Another part complied with the Republican ideals of the February Revolution. That revolution, as we mentioned, should be mentioned, opened a door to the short-lived Russian democracy and republic. So essentially, I believe that the February Revolution in Russia in 1917 was much more important for Russia than the October Revolution, because the February Revolution created the Russian Republic and instigated the idea of republicanism in the Russian political culture. And the Great Council of Moscow, which held in 1917 through 1918, encapsulated the republicanism of the February Revolution. The ideals of the Republic and of the Great Council survived in a past, in a part of the Russian Church abroad, which became known as the Russian Exarchate under the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Well, as we know, this Exarchate was dissolved quite recently and became kind of divided between several jurisdictions, especially in France. The Moscow Patriarchate, the third part of the Russian Orthodoxy, eventually developed a symbiosis with the Soviet regime and the communist ideology. This church accommodated itself to the new Soviet realities with great pain and many sacrifices. A considerable number of its members did not accept these realities. They either were killed by the Soviet regime or ended up in the underground. Some of the former, the underground church, became known as the new, the kind of those who were killed, became known as the new martyrs, Novomucheniki, while many of the latter broke relations with the official church and formed several sects. Repressions against the church began soon after the Bolsheviks took power in their hands on October 25th or November the 7th, according to the new calendar of 1917. The leader of the Bolshevik Revolution, Vladimir Lenin, promulgated in January or February, according to the new calendar, 1918, a decree which radically separated the church from the state. Following the decree, the Bolshevik authorities launched a campaign of confiscating ecclesiastical properties. Soon, the first victims of the persecutions fell, including senior hierarchs like Metropolitan Vladimir of Kiev and Benjamin of St. Petersburg. The persecutions culminated during the so-called Great Terror of 1937 through 1938, instigated by Joseph Stalin. These persecutions became less intensive when the World War II began. By 1939, only around 100 churches remained open in the entire Soviet Union, out of about 60,000 in 1917. So 60,000 1917 churches, and then just 100 churches open in 1939. Approximately 400 bishops were persecuted and 300 died. Thousands clergymen and over 500,000 laypersons perished in the Soviet prisons and the system of forced labor camps, coordinated by the so-called main Directorate of Camps. The abbreviation for it is Gulag. Of them, over 36,000 are regarded martyrs, according to the database produced by St. Tikhon's Orthodox Humanitarian University. The first new martyr recognized by the Russian Orthodox Church was as Patriarch Tikhon Belavin. He was elected by the Great Council of Moscow in 1917 and led this church during the troublesome early years of the communist regime. Tikhon refused to collaborate with this regime, just as he refused to collaborate with its opponents, various monarchist movements that fought for the restoration of Tsardom. In January 1918, he promulgated a pastoral letter which condemned the oppressive communist policies towards the church. For example, let me quote some parts of this decree by Tikhon. He said, "By the authority given us by God, we forbid you to present yourselves," meaning the communists, for the sacraments of church, and anathematize you. Well, he openly, explicitly anathematized the communists. "If you still bear the name of Christians, even if merely on account of your baptism, you still belong to the Orthodox Church. I adjure all of you who are faithful children of the Orthodox Church of Christ not to commune with such outcasts of the human race in any matter whatsoever." That was a very strong statement by Tikhon. Less than 10 years later, the locum tenens of the patriarchal throne, Metropolitan Sergei Stragorodsky, whom I mentioned, and who would become the patriarch in 1943, promulgated a completely different kind of statement. This time, it was not condemning, but appeasing the communist regime. The statement was published in the Central Soviet newspaper Izvestia on August 18, 1927. It is regarded one of the most striking examples of conformism in the history of Christianity, which has been branded as Sergianism after his name. And let me quote this statement, which was published in the Izvestia newspaper. I quote, "At present, our Orthodox Church in the Soviet Union possesses not only canonical, but also fully legal centralized administration consonant with civil laws. We furthermore hope that this legalization will be gradually extended to the lower ecclesiastical administrations, archdiocesan, regional, etc. It is necessary to enlarge upon the significance of the consequences of the change that has occurred in the status of our Orthodox Church, of her clergy, and all her functionaries and institutions." So essentially, he acknowledges that the church has adjusted itself to the new Soviet realities in the terms of administration. And for that, I continue the quote from his crucial article in the Izvestia newspaper. "Let us raise our grateful prayers to the Lord, who has been so gracious to our holy church. Let us also express on behalf of the entire nation our gratitude to the Soviet government for this attention to the spiritual needs of the Orthodox population. And at the same time, let us assure the government that we will not abuse its confidence reposed in us. Addressing ourselves with God's blessing to our synodal labors, we clearly realize the magnitude of our task. We need to show not in words, but in deeds, that not only people in different orthodoxy or those who reject it may be faithful citizens of the Soviet Union, loyal to the Soviet government, but likewise the most fervent adherents of orthodoxy, to whom it is as precious with all its canonical and liturgical treasures as truth and life. We wish to remain orthodox and at the same time to recognize the Soviet Union as our civil fatherland, whose joys and successes are our joys and successes, and whose misfortunes are our misfortunes." That is a kind of the key phrase in the entire statement, that your joys are our joys, meaning your communist, Stalin's joys are our joys, and your sorrows, your losses are our losses. And then he ends his statement: "Every blow directed against the Soviet Union, be it war, boycott, or any other common disaster, or even a whole and corner murder, we acknowledge as a blow against us." Well, this somehow resonates with the current situation, I believe, in Russia, where it seems that the church perceives, the Russian church perceives the war in Ukraine in the same exactly terms as it is perceived by the Kremlin, by the state. So it is clearly a continuation of the Sergian tradition. in the Russian Church. Metropolitan Sergei hoped that through the compromises with the Soviet state, he would secure the survival of the Church. By the World War II, the Russian Church was almost extinguished. It reemerged after the World War II when Joseph Stalin decided to revise his anti-religious policies and make them more tolerant. He wanted to boost the acceptance of the Soviet regime in the traditionally Orthodox areas, which he controlled or wanted to control, such as the Middle East and Eastern Europe. Official representatives of the Moscow Patriarchate were allowed to travel abroad, which was a very big deal. They were allowed to leave the Iron Curtain with the task to showcase the alleged Soviet freedom of consciousness. In the meantime, ordinary members of the church continued suffering and being persecuted. The Soviet policies to the church turned more tolerant around 1988, when the state sponsored pompous celebrations of the millennium from baptism of Kiev. The church could enjoy its freedom only after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Being a persecuted church in the Soviet time, I'm afraid the Russian Orthodox Church turned something which has been described as when a persecuted turns into a persecutor. And it seems that the current trend, mainstream in the Russian Church, is to forget completely the persecutions against the church in the Soviet period, especially under Stalin. That's why Stalin has been heroicized to a great extent, not just in the public discourses in Russia, but also in the church. We are talking now about the Stalinists within the church, the priests and even bishops who proudly call themselves Stalinists, as if there were no martyrs, as if there were no, those hundreds, thousands of bishops, priests, and tens, dozens of thousands faithful who perished in the Stalin's camps. How is it possible that only within really like 2 decades, such a radical change happened to the church, which knew all the sorts of sufferings, all sorts of oppression that one could imagine during the Soviet time, and now imposes the same kind of oppression and sufferings upon others. Well, this remains an open question why this has happened. Certainly, we don't have time to discuss it now. And with this question, I'd like to conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Father Cyril, for this very interesting talk. Before giving the floor to you, I would just like to add that what you said about this Novomученики, these new martyrs, it's very resonating for me because when I was in Moscow, actually I lived there for a couple of months, but I had to leave because of a war. I've seen several churches which were dedicated to these martyrs where priests served there, and after this they were killed, and it's written, so it was very resonating. So are there some questions perhaps from the public?
If I'm allowed, I have some commentaries. And I will commence with the end of your position. I don't think that it's a change now in the attitude of the Orthodox Church of Russia. I think that this kind of imperial sentiment who is present, and even imperial chauvinism who is present in the attitude and the works of the Orthodox Church of Russia, is present until 1945, 1940s. That means that the Church of Russia have recovered not only a position in the Russian society, but proudly assumed the role of the instrument of the Soviet state to impose the Soviet rule in the Eastern Europe countries. And it was a very harsh and very scrupulous instrument of the Soviet power in these countries. In the matter of subduing and controlling the national Orthodox churches of this area. Secondly, for your remark about Romania, I think that 1945 Romania has a very democratic regime imposed in a state, reinstated in Romania after August 23, 1944 coup d'etat of King Michael I. And I think that what you name the regional fascist rule has only 5 or 6 months timing, like duration during all the Romanian history from the autumn of 1914 to January 1941. Your assessment about the sentiment, about the propaganda, about the Nikifor Krajnik or others propagandists is very true, and it's due to the special synthesis made by the Romanian fascists with orthodoxy. It's almost the figure for this kind of embroilment about between politics and the far right politics and the religion. Thank you very much.
Would you like to add something?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think we're on the same page, and I agree that with your clarifications. My understanding is it was not only under the legionary state that the church collaborated with the regime. Also, it was with under Carol II when the patriarch became the prime minister of Romania. It was another kind of token of very close cooperation of the church and the state under the dictatorial umbrella somehow.
Are there some other questions? Perhaps from the Zoom? No?
To continue our debate in absence of other intervenants, I think that what you are saying is that in the Orthodox world, the Orthodox churches do to collaborate with the political power. That explains also the willingness of some understanding between the Orthodox Church with the political power, political power during the communist era. That means that the Byzantine Symphony presupposed by the Orthodox doctrine is due to be put in practice in his Caesaro-Papist variant. And I think that for the Orthodox Church of Russia, now is the case. Thank you.
I would also have two questions. First of all, don't you think that the current situation, I would say that it's even more radical than what it was in the Soviet Union. First of all, because I have, of course, you will correct me because you know this much better, but I have the impression that in the Soviet period, so this resistance movement was much stronger than today, first of all. And secondly, I was really struck by this this quote from Patriarch Sergei, yes. Like he distinguished quite clearly the orthodoxy from like the Soviet Union and the power of the Soviet Union. Like he said that we can be Orthodox and at the same time be citizens of this country and so on. And today Putin is positioning himself as an Orthodox and as a kind of defender of Orthodoxy and so on. So don't you think that today it is this cooperation and this tight relationship between the state and the church is paradoxically much, perhaps not much, but closer than in the Soviet Union?
Yeah, I agree. Certainly, in a sense, the relationship between the church and the state in Russia nowadays is unprecedented, in a sense. I studied Byzantine Symphony quite thoroughly, and I studied also different forms of, of affiliation between the church and the state in the modern era. And I think what we're facing in Russia nowadays is quite unprecedented. Of course, there are similarities, there are parallels between what is now in Russia and what exists in the past. But there are no 100% parallels with what was in the past. And I think that the key to understand the current situation is the notion of secularization, if you want. Quite paradoxically, and it fits exactly the topic of our conversation, because I believe, first of all, the stated purpose of the cooperation between the church and the state, the stated one, not the real one, but the stated one, is to oppose together, to confront together the Western style of secularization, right? However, the way in which this confrontation with the Western secularization is happening is very secular per se, but this is a Russian version of secularization. It's not Western secularization, it's Russian secularization, which is very similar to the way how in the West, some fundamentalistic groups like American evangelicals, some of them, not all of them, some of them, follow the same line. They oppose secularization in the way which resembles very much secular patterns, in very secular way, by engaging in a very secular form of politics. And I believe that this ideology of the Russian world, so to say, or generally this ideological frame that the church has provided the Kremlin with, and which underpins the war in Ukraine, because the same ideological frame also instigates the war in Ukraine, it's a completely secular construct. Take, for example, the notion of traditional values, which is very important for the modern Russian discourses. This concept of traditional values is secular intrinsically. I studied this kind of concept also through the writings of Patriarch Kirill, and I found that he started quoting the traditional values in his writings in the 1970s, when this concept was introduced to the kind of sociology of religion exactly as a substitute of religion, not as a supplement to religion, but as a substitute to religion. And essentially what in Russia they try to do, they use concepts that were invented as substitutes of religion in order to fight for the sake of religion. This is really a profound paradox. So we are dealing in Russia, in today's Russia, which pretends to be, the flagship of the anti-modern, anti-secularist, anti-liberal, anti-Western movement. We find a very peculiar form of secularism, which the church has embraced. And as some sociologists of religion, like I think Luckman, has identified that sometimes the churches act as the agents of their own secularization. I believe we are dealing, in the case of the Russian church, with the case of the church promoting and imposing, instigating secularization upon itself. That is a paradox.
I have a question for you about the degree of religiosity of the Russian society. Perhaps the comportment of the Russian Orthodox Church is due to fact that the religion itself in the populace is somehow vidé de sens, somehow without
emptied of its essence. Emptied of its essence.
Yes, empty of the essence, and all these, the rest is the ritual.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I just want to come back to some papers presentations yesterday, particularly the one that I could follow about Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his concept of social cohesion, civil religion. Yes, essentially for Jean-Jacques Rousseau, this civil religion can exist without God, right? It's important as far as it keeps the society together and it secures the cohesion of the society in the situation of when the monarchs don't exist. Essentially, what we are dealing with in Russia nowadays, it's a form of of civil religion. Well, I would explain it even in more kind of radical terms, like it's political religion, which is more coercive than civil religion. It's more violent than civil religion, but it's just about terminology. So essentially, it's a form of civil religion. And it's a sort of religion which is imposed by the church upon the Russian society, or offered by the church to the Russian society. And the majority of the Russian society has embraced this sort of religion. And this religion doesn't require people to believe in God or to behave in the way which is required by the belief in God. That's what the sociologists of religion say. It can be like belonging without believing or belonging without behaving. In the case of Russia, it's belonging without behaving and without believing. They don't believe in God, not necessarily, and they behave in the most monstrous way, as we saw in Bucha. I'm quite sure that's quite a few Russian soldiers who accomplished the massacre in Bucha and other places. Now Bucha is just revealed, but we will see many more places in Ukraine that suffer the same fate. I'm pretty much convinced that quite a few even, soldiers who committed those crimes are active Christians. They would go to the church, at least, for the Christmas and Easter. They would even probably take communion. I received reports like the soldiers stealing the holy relics from the icons. They steal everything, like children toys, even, kind of a booth for dogs. But they also steal relics. So it means that the relics have value for them. They are not exactly secular. And they, at the same time, rape women. They, kill civilians and so forth. This is a sort of civil religion, which doesn't require from a person to believe in God. And that's exactly what is, I think, happening in Russia.
Yes, and I don't know if you will agree with me, but I think that the percentage of people who are really Orthodox and who go to church and are practicant is quite low, actually, in Russia. If you watch the statistics.
Yeah, exactly. The sociological data say it's not more than 5%. Well, that is a very optimistic kind of. Yeah.
And I would like also to perhaps to nuance, perhaps I'm wrong, but it's my impression that perhaps it's not really like black and white that all bishops are Stalinists today in Russia.
No.
And for example, I was reading an article of Roman Lunkin. You know him, it's a Russian researcher. And he said that interestingly, one of the distinctive features of a Russian Orthodox Church from the official political discourse is rather its anti-Stalinist and anti-Soviet position. Of course, it is not valid for all bishops, but for example, I know that Metropolitan Hilarion, of course, I don't support a lot of his statements, but he's quite anti-Stalinist, for example, and so perhaps it is a little bit more complex. It's not like that they're totally endorsing this Stalinist.
Well, Metropolitan Hilarion is certainly against Stalin, and he made public statements against him. But there are also bishops, not everyone, really kind of a few, but still they're outspoken. They speak up and they go public, and they are not actually contained. They are not kind of disciplined by the leadership of the church, who speak openly in favor of Stalin. I know that when a Metropolitan Hilarion spoke out,
he was criticized.
Not just publicly. The authorities try to discipline him somehow, and at the same time, there is an entire theology of Stalinism, which is evolving, which is very surprising. Imagine, there is one priest, his surname is Shumkin, Father Shumkin. He explains why we should respect and should, adore Stalin by the following theological arguments. He says that every authority comes from God, right? He uses this phrase from Paul. Stalin's authority also came from God. Therefore, if we criticize Stalin, we criticize the authority of God. We go against the Holy Spirit, and that is the deadliest sin that you can imagine. Therefore, it is one of the sin which is unforgivable to criticize Stalin. That is a kind of reasoning that a priest suggests, and he has a following. Quite a few people, follow him and admire him.
Are there some other questions? From the Zoom, it is also possible. No? Then if not, thank you very much, Father Cyril. Je vais laisser la parole maintenant à Hamdi Mlika, qui est professeur